Now, here's the thing with critical race theory right now, is there's this belief that it's trying to rewrite history, right? It's an agenda that's rewriting history. This is where CRT would say, that's actually not historically accurate, so why don't we tell the whole story?
Welcome to Honestly Speaking, a safe place to be unsafe. Live commentary and dialogue from a biblical, logical, cultural, and comical perspective.
Hey, what up, everybody? As per usual, it's your girl, Honest-Leigh from Honestly Speaking. How are you doing? Hopefully you have a tribe that you can pour into and one that is pouring into you. Whew. It has been a crazy time recently, like extremely crazy. But let's talk. So much has been going on in the world. Things we need to talk about. So let's dig into some topics, okay? Welcome back to Honestly Speaking, a safe place to be unsafe. Today, I'm actually interviewing my good friend, Dr. Sarah Brubaker, who is a Christian, is an educator, and is an actual PhD who has studied critical race theory. It's important to note that throughout this conversation, she will not be speaking on behalf of all CRT theorists, but this conversation is to give us a brief understanding of what critical race theory is, what it isn't, and why it's not the devil, nor is it the answer. Hope you enjoy. And please make sure you have an open mind. This is part 1 of CRT with a PhD. Welcome back, folks, to Honestly Speaking. I am blessed to have my good friend, Dr. Sarah Brubaker. But we're about to have a conversation about what the boogeyman, critical race theory. And so we're seeing a lot going on in our society of people saying critical race theory is this, critical race theory is that. You know, you can't speak about anything without somebody saying, well, CRT, put CRT in my closet, that put CRT in my food. And next thing I know, I'm a racist. So people don't really understand what it is. And so I figured, let's ask someone who may know a little bit about what this is. So Sarah, could you introduce yourself, tell them what you study, what your degree is in, and
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am really excited, also a little nervous. But yeah, so my degree, I have a doctorate of education in educational leadership with a specialization in transformational leadership. My research focused on white professors who taught in teacher education programs. And so I studied how they experienced white students who are going to be teachers, how they experienced those white students engaging in discussions about race, and then the strategies they used to engage those students about race. So where CRT comes in, critical race theory comes in, as in your research, you need to have a conceptual framework, that kind of lens in which you see the information and the data and the way that you analyze it. And so mine was an integration of critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, and social constructionism.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying in order to get your PhD, your thesis, the framework on it was with 3 lenses: critical race theory, you said
critical whiteness studies,
and
social constructionism.
All right. So we're going to leave critical whiteness studies and social constructionism to the side, but we're going to approach the critical race theory aspect. And I'm glad you said that it is the lens through which you had to study, because it kind of tells where we're going in this conversation, and also where people are, I want to say, manipulating information when it comes to critical race theory. Now, what is critical race theory?
Yeah, so another, obviously, if you're watching this, you can see that I'm white. So another, surprisingly, but just another kind of comment about that is is I am looking at this from the lens of being a white woman. I just want to disclaim that I understand that, and that this is all from my own lens as we talk about lenses and worldviews and frameworks.
So are you saying right now that Dr. Sarah Brubaker, that you are a white woman
White.
who has studied critical race theory, and you're a Christian?
And I'm a Christian.
Oh, what will they think? What are the people in the congregation gonna say? Like, what?
Talk about intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw.
Right. So again, could you just explain a bit more about what critical race theory is and why is it a theory?
Yes. Yeah. So critical race theory, CRT, like you mentioned, is a theory. Essentially, many scholars hold it as a diagnostic tool. But the premise behind it, there's a couple primary presuppositions behind it. One being that American society and many CRT scholars, including Kimberly Crenshaw, who is like the OG of CRT, hold that this is also a global society as well, with the colonization, the whiteness of colonization and white normativity throughout the globe. But for our purposes, American society is a racialized society. So in other words, the way that people experience society in the United States for our purposes is based on what race you are. So CRT, it's fluid. It's not a box set of definitions or concepts. It's a general concept that follows the presupposition that race is socially constructed, and that it's ingrained in every aspect of American life. Again, for our purposes, America, although you could make many, many arguments that this is has been globalized with colonization. But so CRT was introduced in the legal field in the 1980s, though its roots actually trace all the way back to W.E.B. Du Bois. In terms of the formalized and the seminal writing of CRT, it really goes back to Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw in the legal field. And particularly it was used in breaking down, understanding, and analyzing how systemic racism underlie many, if not all, of our policies in the United States, and that they were created, whether unintentionally or more likely intentionally, with the purpose of oppressing people groups based on their race. Again, during this time and the way that it's panned out throughout history and currently today, particularly Black African American people. So an example of this, if you're talking about legality, would be redlining, which of course still happens today, right? We know it still happens today. And then kind of the shift in how that legally became okay, and then CRT was used to kind of examine and show how that then of course creates this cycle of continued poverty and continued oppression and all other aspects that come along with that. So that started in kind of the legal area. Now my expertise, the area that I really focus in with CRT is education, and I think currently education is like the primary fighting grounds right now for what we're hearing for CRT. It's like keep CRT out of the schools and no CRT curriculum and things like that. So while CRT started in the legal field and there's CRT related to critical feminist theory and gender studies, and kind of where Kimberly Crenshaw really began this idea of intersectionality, where CRT is in lots of different aspects of society. And it really does show the fact that we can have all of these different fields of critical race theory, shows really how pervasive this systemic racism and injustice is. And I think even in another sense of the legal issues, so redlining is maybe not as obvious, especially to people who especially white people who don't grow up in those areas or with that lens, seeing it and understanding it. I think even more recently, days old, you can see in voter suppression sanitized to be called election fraud policies.
So here's the thing, and correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that CRT is a theory, It's a theoretical lens through which people can understand the world we live in by acknowledging and looking at how race is a key factor in almost every structure that is going on, and that its roots, although you can trace it to critical theory and even W.E.B. Du Bois before the 60s and the 50s, but really were in legal studies to see how the law was still influenced by race, even though it didn't outright name race. So really quick, for instance, for those who are my viewers, it's kind of like, I don't know if anyone's ever studied like Lee Atwater, right? So Lee Atwater, he was the political campaign manager for Ronald Reagan, and it's this quote. I'm actually gonna play it.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like force busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
So what he's saying is, we're going to weaponize and deconstruct the language in such a way that we can describe a thing without exactly naming a thing. So, for instance, if you say inner city or urban, what comes to mind? Someone black. If you say soccer mom or suburban, what comes to mind? Someone white, right? That's the way, like if I say Karen, a white woman comes to mind, even though I never said white woman, I just said Karen. Do you understand how this is very pervasive? You're saying that CRT was created to study how instead of racism being overt, it became subvert and structural, and looked at how these particular structures still impact Black folk and all other folk, i.e. Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, to this very day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And you can even trace it before Atwater back to Barry Goldwater with Nixon, and they came up with what's called the Southern Strategy.
The Southern Strategy, that's right.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. The idea of shifting racism from overt to covert, and to be able to subtly use language to reflect what people know what you're saying, but you're not actually saying it. And it's created this ability to be defensive and to not be accountable. Mm-hmm. And I would say, and there are lots of scholars who would say, CRT scholars who would say that this is not just, white normativity is not just for white people, right? White normativity has been inherently ingrained in everyone. And this is, you see all the way back, the psychological study conducted and then used to find favor with Brown in Brown versus Board of Education, was the dolls, right? And how that was internalized, and that was really damaging. Now, again, an example of covert racism rather than overt is that we always leave out the second part, which is that research study actually showed that white students were also being damaged by segregation.
Right.
We look at it and say, oh, it was just the little Black kids who were damaged by segregation. But the reality is that it was white kids as well. And this is the second and additional presupposition of CRT is that there's not really a benefit to society acknowledging covert racism and acknowledging like where there's like legal issues in people of color, in particular Black people, not being protected or being given the rights that they're promised.
So can I stop you right there? So folks, what Dr. Brubaker is saying is that the system is set up to defend itself, right?
Correct.
In such a way that it can make you think that it's actually there to defend you, but it's not. It's trying to defend itself. You know what it is? It's the HR department at your job, right? So the HR department is like, you have these rights, these rights, these rights, these rights. Let you sue your job and see
how quick that HR department
quickly they shift.
Yeah.
Because you have to understand there are people who have vested interests and they've built their identity and they created certain power structures on them maintaining their position, which by default makes you maintain your position. So even though they may not directly or even consciously want you to be oppressed, if you being oppressed allows for them to maintain their level of comfort or power, they will defend it. Not even if it's on a subconscious level, they will defend it. I'll give you another example, folks. We like these devices, cell phones, right? Like, so we like cell phones. The batteries for these particular phones come from a metal called coltan. Most people don't know coltan is actually mined a lot of places in Africa, and they use child slave labor to mine coltan. A lot of this information is being suppressed because they don't want us to be depressed while we use our devices for our own convenience. Now, having said that, here's the catch-22. Am I not going to use the cell phone? No, I have to. This is the society we live in. I have to use a cell phone, but I am very mindful of the updates. I don't have to have the latest. I'm mindful of how I use my phone, okay? I saw something that said, live simply so that others may simply live. And so what Dr. Brubaker is saying, folks, is that whether we realize it or not, English is a very semantic-based language. It's one of the perfect languages for intellectual asymmetrical warfare, in that it can hide nuance in semantics and nuance, so that way we become mentally tired and don't even want to engage in the discussions that'll lead to the breakdown of a power structure. And that's what I think Dr. Brubaker is leaning towards, what's going on with CRT. They're basically saying CRT is all this other stuff that it's really not.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said it, because you said it much better than I did and could. That's exactly what it is. And it's this Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, she mentions that this is just a new iteration. It's just the same thing being packaged in a way that is socially acceptable. It's sanitized enough, it's overt enough that for the people who create a bigger voter bloc, for the people who sit in power, who make decisions that we then put there to make it, it makes us feel okay with the way things are. We don't have to change it. There's not a benefit to the majority in power to change those things. Yeah.
And so again, the way CRT works is not talking about the overt things, it's looking at the covert things. For instance, CRT is saying that they're looking at the tomatoes in the spaghetti sauce, if you will. And so we're talking about and they're like, no, it's in the sauce. You don't even understand. You're looking for chunks of this, that. No, the actual the base for the sauce is the thing, folks. And you don't realize it because you're in it. And for those who don't understand that, I kind of say it's kind of like having an accent, right? So being from Philly, I never knew my Philly accent was a Philly accent until I went outside of Philly, and people were just like, you sound like you're from Philadelphia. And I'm like, nah, I don't. I just say John, radiator, and water. You know what I mean? Like Right. So it's kind of like that. It's very covert in that particular sense. So CRT looks at how covert it is as it pertains to legal studies and other structures, i.e. education, with Dr. Brubaker.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi Coates uses a phrase that actually exists elsewhere. I think it actually started off as a joke, but he says, does a fish know they're wet? No, because they're in the water, right? I also say water, by the way, from Phillies. But it's the same thing. It's there's no, does a fish know they're wet? No, because they've never been outside of it. So that's exactly what it is. And so a practical example of how CRT would be used in education, because that seems to be kind of where like the emotional high is, right? Like, again, when we're talking about, I want to be really clear that in my personal opinion, I think that people who are making these decisions know exactly what they're doing. I think the people, maybe the parents that are like having a minor freak out right now about CRT, I think they're like giving into the propaganda of it. But I think that this is very strategic, and there is a very clear strategy in what is happening, right? Like, so an example of how CRT would work in education, it's not a curriculum. It's not something that you would even teach in schools. It's a diagnostic tool. So, for example, I read this story the other day. It was close to Juneteenth, and someone was writing the story about the Alamo, and I thought this was like the perfect example of how we would use CRT in schools, in elementary schools. So the story of the Alamo is a story that I grew up on. I remember having like Disney used to have these live action movies, and one of them, like there was a mini series with like Davy Crockett. And so it followed like his kind of a couple big parts of his life. And one of the things that it followed was the Alamo. And so I remember this like sense of patriotic pride in the Alamo, right? And it was, if you were to ask, I would say many people in the United States, maybe not even just many white people, many people in general, but definitely white people, about what the Alamo was, they would say that it is this group of white men who stood for independence and freedom and against the tyranny of the Mexican government, right? That was, we have the motto, remember the Alamo. That's like the thing.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I don't think they would say white. They would just say men and
That's true. That's true. I'm glad you said that. You're exactly right, because that's part of white normativity, right? We don't say the pitcher, we say the black pitcher or the Asian pitcher, right? The norm that we other the others, right?
Right.
And that's part of the normativity. Yeah.
Right.
So that's, and the reason I said specifically that it was white is because they were specifically white men fighting for white things. So that's what you learn in school, that the Alamo is. So what CRT would do is they would come in and ask questions. So CRT is a critical theory, and there's lots of branches of critical theory. There's critical feminist theory, there's critical pedagogy. You can hold to critical theory without being in a particular category. It simply means that you want to ask reflective questions and assess it in order to assess the presuppositions or the foundation of something. That's what critical theory essentially is, right? So critical race theory would come in and say, okay, well, is that the actual history of the Alamo? No. What is the actual history of the Alamo is that the Mexican government invited white settlers to come to Texas because they were afraid of Native Americans in that area, and they wanted these white settlers who had no problem. Again, it's white people doing what we, did really well back then, which is be racist, and overtly racist. At this point, it's overt, right? We'll have them come in, and they can be the ones who partake in genocide, right? That's essentially what happened. So they came in. When they got there, they realized this land is perfect for growing cotton. And what do we need for growing cotton is we need slaves. The problem with this, however, is that in the 1820s, the Mexican government was beginning to rewrite their constitution. And part of the constitution that they wanted to rewrite is they wanted to outlaw slavery. Well, this didn't work for these white settlers who were coming in who wanted to now grow cotton. Essentially, what ended up happening was Mexico decided, I think in 1826, they decided to give the Mexican states, basically like we did, you can decide what you want to do with slavery in your own state. Well, 6 months after they signed this law, the state made it very clear if someone was enslaved and came on Mexican soil, they would become free. And so this was obviously too much for these white settlers. And so they decided that they were going to now fight for independence and freedom, specifically the ability to have slaves. So when we talk, and we have, now here's the thing with critical race theory right now, is there's this belief that it's trying to rewrite history, right? It's an agenda that's rewriting history. So, but the problem is that we have authenticated documents from both the Mexican government and from the United States government outlining overtly, this is before it became covert, overtly outlining that this is the case. John Quincy Adams literally wrote a letter that explained that we were fighting for independence, specifically between emancipation and slavery, and that we as the United States were being dragged into it on the side of slavery. It's very clear that the Alamo was a result of white men fighting to maintain slavery. So, but that's not what's taught, right? It's this whitewashing and this glorification of this patriotic heroes who died defending the United States against tyranny. This is where CRT would come in and say, that's actually not historically accurate. So why don't we tell the whole story?
Girl, they are going to call you a traitor.
Wouldn't be the first time, to be honest.
Going to call you a traitor. So let me make this, let me give it in a biblical example for those of us who are listening who are Christians. Remember in the Bible where Paul rebukes this woman who had this like psychic divination spirit in her? And what was she doing before they came? What was she doing? She was saying, prepare ye the way of the Lord. These people are coming. So what she said wasn't false, but it had a spin on it that took away the truth. It spoiled the truth. So what does Paul turn around and do? He rebukes the spirit out of the woman, and then her sponsor or pimp got upset at this. Now, somebody who was looking could have been like, what she said, it wasn't wrong. No, it was wrong because the spirit, quite literally, in which she said it and the purpose for which it was spun and the way that it was spun was a lie. Right. So again, what Dr. Brubaker is saying is that critical race theory says that the way in which we're even taught to look at the world has already given us a lens. It's much like how I was talking to somebody and I said, well, we do know that Christianity in America is West contextualized for the West. And somebody was like, well, I don't think that's true. And I was just like, wait, what language is our Bible in again? Like, just basically it's in English. Yeah. So let's just start with the fact that we're reading the English Bible, right? So we're reading the English Bible, and a great example of in the scripture where it talks about the trumpets, right? You know, it talks about the trumpets. And so, hey, when we think trumpets, we think brass trumpets, right? Mm-hmm. To show you how westernized the world is, when we take the Bible and go to other countries, we still use trumpets. But here's the thing, y'all. It's not an actual trumpet. It's a ram's horn. So when they translated it into what was contextualized for their culture so that their culture can understand it. What CRT would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Brubaker, is that that's fine when it comes to your culture, but the problem is you do that with other cultures so that other cultures, like in the Middle East, where they actually have show stars, you got them walking around saying trumpet. And it's like, no, it's not. Just tell them to say what they already have. Tell them to say what they already have and what they already use. That's what it's saying. It's saying it's baked in the sauce. It's in the ingredients. It's in the flour. Black folks would say it's in the seasoning. It's something in the, that's what it's saying. That race has been constructed in a way to create a power structure where individuals are put in these systems where you base yourself and identity on blackness and whiteness and your proximity to those two things.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yep. The idea of proximity is really important here.
Right. So I think that Latinos are like the best case study on the planet to talk about race, because race makes no sense outside of black and white, folks. That's right. You gotta understand me. And it ain't biblical. We already talked about this before. Race ain't biblical, right? Nationality is, culture is, ethnicity is, boom. Even where you are in class, rich, poor, all of that, all biblical. Race, that's some made up trash that we gotta fight because of racism, right? Race ain't real, but racism is. In society, we must realize there was a time when Jewish people were not white. Italians were not white. Irish folks were not white. None of them were white. It was very waspy. And when people came to America, they had to choose often. Which one you gonna sit in the back of the bus or the front of the bus? Right. Who's gonna go from a bad situation to a bad situation? So therefore, we start basing our existence on whiteness or proximity to.
Yeah, I was just gonna follow up with one more aspect of that, and actually two. That another presupposition of CRT is that race is socially constructed. So when I chose those three theories to integrate, there's a very specific reason for that. And the social constructionism aspect of it is that we are constructed based on the experiences that we've had and based on the categorization that society gives to us, right? And so I think nowadays you would probably not find that many white people, except for those who are like for real white supremacists, like that's their goal is white supremacy, like their overt goal is that. You probably wouldn't find that many people who said that black and white people are biologically different. That's right. It's not socially acceptable anymore, and so many people wouldn't say that outright. But during this time when this was really being developed, the seminal works were being developed, it was still very much so. You still had kind of this research between black athletes where their shins longer, where their muscles different, like, you know, so there was still this idea of like biology included in this. And so CRT, one of that aspect, like you're talking about, there are biological differences between ethnicities, and there are differences in nationality between people, but race really is where that kind of falls apart. But the only other thing I wanted to mention is the idea, going back to the idea of CRT being used as a diagnostic tool, and this is kind of one of the criticisms that CRT has, is that it doesn't really offer a concrete praxeology for change.
What do you mean by concrete praxeology, Doctor?
Like there's no set path to solve any of these problems that they are highlighting, essentially. Okay. Which again, it's a theory, and theories aren't really meant to do that. So it's kind of a nitpicky criticism, but really it's one of the only, if you like look up like legitimate criticisms for CRT, that's one of the only ones that we have for it in terms of the way that it's kind of been written about and developed and kind of proven. But again, it's a theory, and theories are by nature not concrete, and they're not praxeological. They don't have practice to them. But the idea then is that behind this is that for education, because again, that's my field, would be that the quote from time immemorial that the victor writes history, right? The victor writes the history. And so when there's this claim or this fear that CRT is rewriting history or it's an agenda, there needs to be a pushback that it's not rewriting history, it's correcting history. It's a holding history and historians accountable
I like
to
that.
You know,
like
so
that.
it's an example. That's an example. The Alamo, of course, we have many examples. You want to talk about, Thomas Jefferson, right? And the fact that he was in love with, with Sally, and the whole romanticization of that, right? Like,
Right.
that is for lots and lots of levels of being problematic. But that's another example of in the schools where CRT would be a really useful diagnostic tool in shining a light on, we need to tell the whole story here, and maybe we need to ask why we're not telling the whole story.
So what did we learn? We learned that CRT is an actual lens through which we can look at the past of how America has racism at the roots and how that racism affects certain laws and other structures. In short, CRT is not trying to be the answer. It's actually just saying that there is a different way to look at history in order to examine one of the key elements that was at the foundation of our nation, which is racism. We also learned that not all critical race theorists think the same. For instance, some may think that racism was the key element at the foundation of our nation, while others believe it was a key element at the foundation of our nation. So please, when you hear CRT, don't allow people to put it in a particular box. It's just a lens. And lastly, we learned that CRT could be and is more likely being used as a scapegoat or a straw man by people who don't want to have difficult conversations or engage in social justice. So please tune in to our next episode as we continue in part 2 of this interview, because in this upcoming episode, we're actually going to be talking about how CRT does and does not fall in line with biblical justice. Wait. You already know what to do. Like, share, and subscribe. Like, subscribe, and share. Subscribe, like, and share. But just make sure you do all three. And also, for those who don't know, I do a live on my Facebook every other Thursday at around 7-ish. So please, make sure you tune in. I got some great co-hosts. We tackle great topics, and yeah. For more on this topic, please check this link.